After the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Virginia, the United States poised to make a response against this greatest attack of terrorism that had ever taken place on our soil. And a few weeks after that initial attack, the United States initiated a counterattack on the military installations in Afghanistan. And when that took place, Gallup poll was taken in the United States of popular response and support for this military action. And according to that response, 90% of Americans who were polled favored this military action against these particular sites in Afghanistan. 5% of the population was opposed to the attack, and another 5% being undecided. Now, obviously, a 90% approval rating for anything that the government does is extremely high and extremely unusual, but nevertheless, there were those who demurred and who protested in the public square in the United States, being opposed to armed retaliation, seeing this as an unjustifiable act of revenge, and we heard the pleas to give peace a chance. And once again, the question of the legitimacy of warfare was raised in our nation. And questions were raised specifically to the church in terms of the historic Christian position with respect to nations being engaged in warfare. And it's that particular issue that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of lectures that we're having. The whole question of the legitimacy of warfare is rooted in some other questions. First of all, the original function and purpose of civil government. That's one aspect in which the question has to be addressed. Also, we have to raise the question of the legitimacy or illegitimacy of capital punishment, because in the final analysis, what warfare involves is capital punishment on a grand scale. And the third mortal issue that we have to consider in discussing the question of whether warfare is ever just is the whole principle of the right of self-defense. I remember when I began my teaching career 30-some years ago, we had a young daughter who was only at the time 4 or 5 years old, and we lived next door to a family that had a son the same age. And this son used to come over and play in the backyard in the sandbox with our daughter, but he was a little bit belligerent and something of a bully. And several days in succession, our daughter came in crying and sniffling and sobbing because the little boy next door had punched her. And we had tried to instruct our daughter not to retaliate in kind and not to return evil for evil. And but this was becoming such a problem that it was getting out of hand. Even when we talked to the parents who sought to restrain their child from this act of bullying other children, it was to no avail. And so I had a conversation with my daughter, and I said, honey, the next time he hits you, try to think of something that might stop him from doing it again. I didn't want to come right out and say, hit him back. But I said, you try to think of something. So the very next day, I hear my daughter wailing and crying and coming in the back door, and I said, what's the matter, honey? And she said, he hit me again. I said, well, what did you do? And she said, I couldn't think of anything to do. So I said, well, let me give you a suggestion. I said, the next time he begins to attack you and starts to hit you, hit him back. And so the very next day, I was in the kitchen, and all of a sudden I heard this ungodly scream, this wailing coming from the backyard, sounding like the squealing of a stuck pig. And I rushed to the back door and opened it, and I looked out and I saw my daughter, 4 or 5-year-old daughter, on top of this guy with her fist clenched, and she looks up at me and she said, "Should I hit him again, Daddy?" She learned the principle of self-defense in this little encounter, and actually it was the end of the bullying. And of course, in this kind of act of self-defense, there was the use of violence. There was the use of force. But the question is, was it justified? When we began Ligonier Ministries in 1971 in western Pennsylvania, we were still deeply involved in the Vietnamese War, and there were many young people that would come to our campus who were objecting to the United States' involvement in that war. And you will remember, if you were alive at that time, that there's never been a conflict in which our country has been engaged in which there was so much dissent as there was during that time. And the nation was divided between two groups who were defined as the hawks and the doves. And I would listen to some of the slogans and some of the arguments that came from both sides on that occasion, where the hawks were favoring increased military engagement in Vietnam, where the doves were calling for our withdrawing from Vietnam and not continuing our involvement in this conflict. And in our next lecture, we'll talk about the whole question of whether individuals have the right to pick their wars and exercise the principle of conscientious objection. But for now, I'm just mentioning in passing that the climate in the early 70s was one of intense debate in our country about the justness of our nation's involvement in Vietnam. But that, again, had to be dealt with against the broader picture of the question, is it ever appropriate for a nation to be engaged in warfare? Now, against this backdrop of question and controversy, I want to mention, first of all, that historically, the majority position within Christianity has been the position endorsing the so-called just war theory. The just war theory. Now, there have been those who have rejected the just war theory and who have adopted a position of pacifism, saying that since the gospel does not operate with the sword and the particular ethic that is given to us in the New Testament, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount, we are told not to return evil with evil, and if someone smites thee on the right cheek, turn the other to him as well. And so on the basis of some of those texts, there have been those groups within historic Christianity who have rejected the just war theory and have in its place embraced some form of pacifism. Now, however, historically, the just war theory has been based upon the teaching of the New Testament with respect to the role and the responsibility of the civil magistrate, among other principles. Now, we wonder, how do we understand in the first instance Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount about turning the other cheek? I remember speaking on the Beatitudes at a Pittsburgh Steeler Bible study. And the Steelers in the 70s had many Christians on the team, and I frequently was involved in giving some Bible studies to them. On this one occasion, I was trying to illustrate the significance of Jesus' exhortation in the Sermon on the Mount about turning the other cheek. And I asked for a volunteer from the audience that I might illustrate the difficulty of understanding what Jesus was saying, and the person who volunteered was L.C. Greenwood. And if you remember L.C. Greenwood, he was part of the famous Steel Curtain, and he was gargantuan in size. And I said, I'm going to pretend to hit L.C. on his right cheek. Now, in order for me to do that, I'm going to need a chair to stand on, because I couldn't even reach his cheek from my position. And so I stood on this chair and was face to face with this giant of a man. And I said, now, Elsie, please don't respond, because I'm not going to hurt you. And as I stood in front of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I'm standing on a chair face to face with L.C. Greenwood, taking my life in my hands, as it were, to illustrate a theological point, I said, Jesus said, if anyone strikes you on your right cheek, turn your left to him as well. Now, here is L.C. Greenwood standing right in front of me. And I said, if I'm going to hit him in the right cheek, and I am right-handed, as the vast majority of people are, how am I going to pull it off? And so I leaned on the chairs, on my tiptoes, and I reached my arm all the way around him so that my right hand came around to his right cheek, and I tried to hit him gently on the right cheek. And everybody laughed. And L.C. was a good sport and didn't flatten me, as it were. I said, actually, if I'm going to hit him on his right cheek, I have one of two options. I can hit him with a left hook, which is not a very good opening gambit in this kind of conflict. Or I can hit him on his right cheek with my right hand by using the back of my hand. And what Jesus is speaking of in the sermon is an idiomatic phrase from antiquity of the insult. What Jesus is saying is that if somebody insults you by slapping you across the face, challenging you, you turn the other cheek as well. This was not an absolute prohibition against the right of personal self-defense if one is attacked by someone intending to bring bodily harm to you or to your family. The principle of self-defense is deeply rooted in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament, even when Jesus commanded his disciples to take swords on a certain occasion, although forbade them from using them in the case of defending him at the time of his arrest. But when Jesus said to Peter to put up his sword, when he had cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest in the garden, Jesus was not saying at that point that Peter was wrong to have a sword. But on that occasion, Christ was submitting himself to be placed under arrest. And what, in so many words, he was saying to Peter, this is not the time. But there's no absolute prohibition against the use of arms in the protection of oneself or of one's family. I've had to struggle with this in a strange way in my own household in recent weeks, because we've had 7 visitations at night from an unwanted intruder. This intruder has now broken into my garage 4 times and has ripped out the screen on my porch and has come through that screen to be on my back porch, but has yet to come into the actual interior of my house. And I'm struggling with this because this nocturnal intruder is a very large black bear, which animal is a protected species in the state of Florida. And I'm calling the Game Commission to say, at what point do I have the right to use force to protect my family from the invasion of this animal? I mean, so far they've told me not yet. And yet the castle law in our state and in most states that allows people to use weapons to protect their homes from invaders, the castle rule says that if somebody comes into your house, you can shoot them. But of course, humans are not protected species in the United States, as we know from our abortion laws. But in any case, these are practical questions that we face with respect to the use of force to protect ourselves from harm. Now, the just war theory begins with the premise, according to Augustine, and it was repeated later by St. Thomas Aquinas, with this premise: all wars are evil. All wars are evil. That's the premise. Now, the footnote to this in Augustine and Aquinas is, of course, that the exception to the rule is the conquest of Canaan in the Old Testament, where God himself commanded the invasion of the land of Canaan because he had delivered it to the hands of his people. And this was the only holy war of antiquity. And a holy war, for it to be undertaken, must have the direct command of God. And since God is not speaking audibly from heaven right now, and we don't have agents of revelation right now to guide us, Christians believe in theory that there are no holy wars available to us. This is one of the points, by the way, that divides us from Islam thinking, where the Muslim world does believe in the legitimacy of the jihad, or the holy war that is waged against infidels and so on. But we don't recognize any such thing as a jihad, a holy war undertaken under the banner of the cross. This was one of the issues that the church had to face during the Crusades, when there the banner of Christ was used to attend an army that went on campaigns to free the Holy Land from the Turkish invaders. But that aside, the principle is all wars are evil. And the reason why they're evil is that because people who are basically innocent with respect to the issues involved in the war are killed or maimed. Violence is done to property, to people, to all aspects of life in warfare. War is not a good thing. Christianity does not see its mandate to spread warfare. We are not to be a bellicose people, but we are to be peacemakers and trying to extend the status of peace throughout the land. Christ was himself the Prince of Peace. Nevertheless, we still ask the question, even though all wars are evil, does that mean that every participant in a war is engaged in doing evil? The just war theory says this: all wars are evil, but not everyone's involvement in war is necessarily evil. There may be a war where both sides are wrong and both sides are engaged in unjust conflict. And so that would not be a just war. But there are also occasions where one nation clearly acts as an aggressor against another nation, and the lesser nation becomes victim to the playground bully, as it were. And in that case, the civil magistrate of the nation who has been attacked by the imperialistic government or the aggressor not only has the right biblically, according to the just war theory, but the responsibility to use whatever force is necessary to defend the innocent from that invader. That is, this is the same principle of defending your home against the intruder graduated to the grand scale of national defense. Now, sometimes you will hear people say, yes, we agree that all wars are evil and that wars never have accomplished anything. That, I think, is an exceedingly naive judgment. If anybody has ever read the diary of Anne Frank and got inside the mind of a child who was being hidden from the Nazis who had invaded Holland and occupied Holland and had carted millions of Jews off to the death camps to be exterminated as part of the genocide program of Adolf Hitler, and you know what happened to Anne Frank, that she was one of these who was carried away. And you look at that Holocaust that took place in the 20th century, and if you stare that monster in the eye, and you see that there are, after the 8 million Jews that were slaughtered in this operation, still several million Jews that survived, ask those surviving Jews whether anything was accomplished by the defeat of Hitler and his forces. Ask the nations, ask the French, if anything was accomplished by the liberation of France from the domination of Nazi Germany. Ask the people in the Ukraine if anything was accomplished by the ouster, or the death at least, of Joseph Stalin, who murdered millions in the Ukraine. I mean, it's really silly to say that these conflicts don't solve any problems. If we mean that they don't end evil, that's true. No war has ever ended evil in the world. But war has, on multitudes of occasions, stopped the aggressor from carrying out a campaign of violence and destruction and wanton murder against innocent people. And so it's in that context that the just war theory says that although all wars are evil, there are occasions when it is just and righteous for certain people to be engaged in warfare to stop the wanton destruction of the aggressor. And we'll talk more about that in the next session.